Hi, my name is Christopher Kinman, and I want to introduce you to Lynn Hoffman. Lynn's life and thought have been close to my heart for many years. For 2 decades we have been conversing together about family therapy, or what she now calls communal practices, as well as about philosophy, politics, about life. Now, throughout these 2 decades, I have lived on the Canadian West Coast, and Lynn has lived on the U.S. East Coast. So our communications went back and forth by phone and email like smoke signals across the continent. Copious ideas emerged within those communications, ample excitement, much love and respect, transported like lines of flight from sea to sea. Lynn has spent her career close to the heart of this developing field of family therapy. Certainly her influence has been felt strongly throughout her profession, but the reverberations go far afield. For those ideas that shaped her thinking over time are now the very ideas that are shaping a new world unfolding before all of us.
This is a story about language. Traditional forms of Western language presume that life is composed of distinct and separate entities, all named and classified, separated from the networks of relations that gave them life and possibility. This story breaks away from that tradition. This new language that Lynn Hoffman invites us towards is a language of relatedness, inviting a circus of newness, humor, rebellion, and all manner of poetic disobedience.
Okay, this part is hard because it brings in a whole philosophy of language and being in the world as well that shakes the foundations of our Western culture, teaching practices, explanation practices, everything that so-called intellectuals love to talk about.
I was gripped by a mystery to which I felt sure there was an answer. But where? What was it? How do you describe it? There was no language. I determined to make a career of my fascination.
Something magical occurs. Lynn Hoffman encounters family therapy, the very beginnings of a new field of practice. Lynn came into family therapy not as a practitioner, but as a writer and an editor. One of the very first persons associated with the field of family therapy, Virginia Satir, asked Lynn to assist in writing and editing her books. Lynn was soon captured. There was a group of these experimenters, including Virginia Satir, Jay Haley, Salvador Minuchin, among others. They were playing with new forms of communication, new ways of engaging with people that had not been previously documented. It wasn't so much the discovery of new therapeutic interventions that was of interest to Lynn. It was the excitement of the newness of these forms of communication, the excitement of entering uncharted territories, of encountering what she later calls unlisted languages.
Often there were great surprises, moments of true respect and even humor that came into the conversation. Here's Lynn talking about Virginia Satir.
And I'll never forget this couple who were both a minister and his wife. And they came in with a boy of about 17. Very handsome, very, stunning pair of white duck pants. His problem was that he had gotten 2 of his schoolmates, 2 girls, pregnant without saying anything to the parents at first. She turned to the boy, who was sitting with his head down over his tight jeans and looking completely upset. And she said, "Well, we know one thing. You have good seed." And the parents just propped themselves up. They were sitting ashamed and kind of surprised. And then she just turned to them and went on and, what's going on, how come, etc. But I was just thrown into a spell by the story. Good seed. So respectful.
In these early days of family therapy, Lynn also encountered what she describes these days as a muscularity within some of the interactions. She tells a story about Salvador Minuchin.
So Minuchin asked her, "You're a fierce little thing. What happens at school when you behave fiercely?" And she said, "Oh, the boys are always coming on at me, but I just do this." And she made her hands into two little fists, and then she charged right at his privates. And he had to do something quick. So he just captured her, held her way up in the air, and said, "You're a fierce little maidel," which is my impression of a Jewish word for young child, girl. And that gesture, that sudden use of, he put her down, she went to that seat, sat down, good as gold. So that was one of the times that I saw him do performance work in a way, poetic, aesthetic performance work.
Central to the development of family therapy during these early days was the multidisciplinary field of study called cybernetics, which was the study of systems, focused a great deal upon the concept of homeostasis, the idea that systems had a corrective function. Families were seen in this way. Challenging behaviors and even psychosis were often seen as homeostatic influences, bringing the family back to a state of equilibrium. There was one thinker who had an enormous impact upon Lynn. That thinker was Gregory Bateson.
I ran across a group of people who had worked with Gregory Bateson, who was an anthropologist, come scholar, come, philosophe, whose work impressed me more than anyone else's in my own life.
I saw that there was this deep shift and that was probably in the future, and I got a sense of it through Bateson.
Trying to end the practice of stabilizing and locating each thing, like psychiatry, that became a thing. Mental illness became a thing. And Gregory Bateson, one of the great impressions he left on me was the idea that you had to give the ecology of any given noun. Otherwise you couldn't understand the fullness of its description. And to illustrate it, he talked about the blind man and the cane and the sidewalk of the street, and the direction that you should go in, and all the other aspects of a blind man's life. But where would you say the creature stops and the objects or inanimate parts of the whole cycle kick in? And do you also include the climate? Is there a thunderstorm and this blind man is trying to walk? Is that part of the ecology? Maybe it's a very hot day. So these are puzzles. But that is a way to describe an ecology in the manner that Bateson tried to show it to us.
Another idea from Bateson was connected to the phrase stamping out nouns.
That's an expression that was invented by a mathematician, friend of Gregory Bateson, called Anatole Holt. And I think it was he who put it into bumper sticker form. And it caught on. It was the age of Aquarius. And the basic idea behind it was that by chopping up the world and society and phenomena in general into little discrete lumps, that you could act so they were real.
The thing, the unit, the animal, the creature, the thought, the concept, that sort of unity is being erased. What's fascinating is that this is a category of language that is being explored, partly because of the technical discoveries like the internet, the smartphone, and so forth by the new generation. And young people all over the world have noticed that there are ways of having the ability to be heard that are not dependent on words alone, that is just a matter of grouping, of assemblages, as Deleuze would say. It was part of my feeling that we should give more honor to Bateson and realize he influenced us in this new departure from the old ideas.
Both Gregory and Lynn and lots of other people, Shakespeare, William Blake, they're in good company, those seagulls, are operating in the realm of relation. And when you look at what relationships are made of, they're made of communication.
And that was the nice part Lynn came into, because she was opening up, unfolding Bateson very easily. She was unfolding ideas, adding something to them and making them even more appealing.
I wanted to get away from the idea of a system that regulates its behavior so it just stays the same. I wanted to show that there was an evolutionary process too where nothing stays the same.
I'm standing beside the Great Fraser River in southwestern British Columbia. In the mid-90s, I was at this spot with Lynn. It was early summer when we were here, and the river was swollen with runoff from the melting snowpack in the mountains. As we together watched the river rolling down to the ocean, a saying came to us. Now, in part, what's interesting about this saying is that she thinks I came up with it, and I think she came up with it. And that is such a familiar experience in the world that Lynn Hoffman walks in. Hers is a world of abundance and complexity. So the question of authorship, the question of who owns what idea, becomes most cloudy, if not irrelevant. The saying that came to us that day was, "The river carries that which the mountains cannot hold." The river carries that which the mountains cannot hold.
Following the publishing of her book, Foundations of Family Therapy, a whole new systemic twist appeared on the scene. A new experiment in family therapy was happening in Milan, Italy, with a group of psychiatrists. What was perhaps most significant about their work was that they developed their ideas and engaged in their practice as a team. This was a most fertile time in family therapy history. Lynn, with Peggy Penn and Cecchine and Boscolo, wrote a book about their work titled Milan Systemic Family Therapy, Conversations in Theory and Practice.
At that point, I think something magic again happened, and was that the Milan groups, that the Milan team, Boscolo and Cecchine, were meeting with some foreigners. They were meeting on some lakes in the north part of Italy. And all these people from all over Europe, and some also not Europe, America, were gathering together and having great fun, but also fighting with ideas and being creative. And it was like it was very, very exciting. And all these groups would go back and fund what had been called the post-Milan groups. There were these conversations going up and down between teams. There was a Swedish team, a Norwegian one in Ireland. There was a Galician at Galveston. There were other teams. There was the KCC in London. There were teams all over, and we would all meet and chat and exchange ideas and fight over them. And the teams were, I think, characterized by trust, and each one was presenting something a little bit different from the time before.
Was out of that cradle, if you like, came what we now know as the collaborative and dialogical movements. Everybody else came at some stage or was there for a part. But a lot of the movement started there in those conversations. And there was a huge collegial support, I think, for people developing contextually, you know, and differences. So I think Lynn is really the godmother of that whole movement, and I don't think people are seeing her as that, but I very much see her as that, and I want to say that very strongly.
For Lynn, as well as for some others, the systems metaphor was running dry.
The next problem that came at me was that I could see from watching family therapy sessions while I was training as a Philadelphia child guidance clinic. I could see that thinking of the family as a system in which the cybernetic idea of homeostatic mechanisms was paramount. The idea of homeostasis was a brilliant idea as an image, but it carried the implication for me that the family was a static mechanical system that didn't change, that any shift was to go rebalance the family so that it could go in the right direction. And families were thought to be able to do that. They had mechanisms like the troubled child, which might create the need for a change in the way the family was structured.
The notion of systems is a metaphor that is restrictive because it still seduces you into a hierarchical hearing and listening position. It still seduces you into a more dualistic position, that you can be in this place where you can observe. People still slip into, regardless of what kind of systems metaphor you use, this expert who is separate from the object.
So there were many instances where we could apply this image or metaphor, and then we fell right into it and drowned. So that was my early career, was to realize that I had fallen in and drowned.
I think it was Harry Galician who said, we've got to drop this cybernetic idea and put people back into the room. And Lynn, was one of the first people to take up that idea and say, we've got to move beyond this machine metaphor, units, machines, trying to make people objects of therapeutic action.
So I got this idea, you have to add to homeostasis, this sort of boring thing that kept you from moving and changing, another dimension which was becoming something different. In other words, instead of to be, we were thinking about to become. And thinking of it as not the usual idea of an agent making a family well or bringing relief from a symptom. But we wanted to change the larger society, especially the mental health system, which was very pejorative in the way it treated clients. So I wrote a paper called Beyond Homeostasis, which argued for another view of the family as more interested in evolution than in stasis, and which challenged the homeostatic version of events with one which accounted for change, for rebellion, for surprise, for all manner of poetic disobedience.
One of the lines of creativity that emerged among the post-Milan groups was the work of the late Norwegian psychiatrist Tom Anderson and his colleagues. Tom is perhaps best known for developing a form of conversation that in the early years was called the reflecting team. Such conversations would circle back and forth. A certain magic would often happen in such conversations. Connections between people would often seem new in some way, and a gentleness would often pervade the room. In such a conversational space, the family would find ways to continue on together.
Tom Anderson and Lynn Hoffman became dear friends, and they engaged together in a project they called Kitchen Table Talk. And that project had two meanings to it. First of all, it was about actually having conversations around a kitchen table. Most therapeutic conversations are in an environment that feels more like a living room, a formal kind of arrangement. But Lynn and Tom liked the democratic feel that the kitchen table gave. The other meaning, they wanted a way of talking that wasn't like the psychiatric and the academic ways of talking. They wanted a way of talking that would be the kind of talk you would have around a kitchen table.
Family therapists like me had been struggling for years to fashion a kitchen table language to describe what we wanted our relationships with people we worked with to be called. We didn't want it to be called therapy anymore. That's a deadly term. It means that you're wanting in some important area and you have to come to a superior person who knows more than you do about a problem that you have with. That the person using that style was preaching or telling people how to behave or in some way imposing his or her view. And we found that this was death in therapeutic counseling. But John Schotter, who's a sociologist and very bright person, and he explained that the difference between monological consciousness and dialogical consciousness, those are terms he used, were too long, too difficult. So John Schotter decided to call the language he didn't prefer aboutness language. He would talk about someone as if they were a separate creature or a man from Mars, or, that would be aboutness language. What John preferred, and most of us realized we also preferred, was talk about withness, being with a person. How do you put that into a practical sphere like counseling? In fact, you do away with counseling as a word entirely. You wouldn't use counseling, you wouldn't use therapy, because they implied a hierarchical position in the discipline that we're talking about, of communication. First of all, you throw the problem word out, and you would describe things in terms of moments of happiness or wishes for the better, a more affirming story. And Tom defined it himself. He always took academic discussions and translated them, and witness suited him just fine. And the upshot was that Tom began to describe his work as the ability to share in the art of social bonds, of creating social bonds. And I like that so much. Witness is the art of making social bonds. It's a different lexicon, different language. Not only understanding another person or a family or a whoever, whatever, but that you had to find some way to attach yourself to the living creature in a more muscular way than we were supposed to do. There was always this boundary between clients and therapists that you were not supposed to cross. But I felt that Tom crossed them very often and effectively.
This way of working troubles some, for it breaks down certain boundaries.
I had a discussion with one of my colleagues that, this is, what kind of future does it have, a kitchen table therapy? Which meant that therapy, or I even don't like more the word therapy we have been discussing. It's just humans meeting each other. And that also connected me with Tom, because he really, the only thing he communicated, the most important thing he was communicating was that we need to be there as humans to get rid of the theories and take those theoretical inner conversations that put distance between us and people. And so, I don't know, Lynn and Tom, when I talk about one, the other one comes up in my mind.
She was starting to talk about therapy as conversation. She was the only one there who was not talking in terms of interventions. And I remember there was a lot of confusion and frustration in many people in the audience, saying, what is this? She's not doing anything. Where's the intervention? And I kind of, at the same time, shared with that puzzlement, and at the same time could tell that this was something really special and different, and something that ended up capturing me. You know, her work, Harlene's, Peggy Penn's, Michael White's, I think they offered a very different way of working and thinking. But she described this shifting away from intervention and strategic work as a therapy for the meek, referring to the therapist. And I felt so identified with that, because I never really felt comfortable doing the more kind of, I don't know how to call it, interventionist therapy. I don't know. At the time I thought it was because I was very young and I didn't feel secure enough. Now I don't know. I think it's also kind of a philosophical thing. But when I read that phrase, I felt, oh yes, that's for me too. You know, that's what I was looking for.
And this way of teaching speaks to the world that is coming toward us, that's much less hierarchical, much more horizontal, and it would all be infused with Lynn's own personal stories. Her triumphs, her defeats, her human struggles. She's mentored a lot of women and helped us to find our voice and a place in this field that I don't think any of us could have done without her.
What came to me was from Alice in Wonderland, that little picture of Alice jumping into the pool of tears which she had dropped from her eyes. So these animal friends of hers were swimming around in this. Alice created a pool, and she had to jump in too. Tom Anderson's work made me feel the way that passage made me feel when I read the book. That there was somehow a way you could join another person or persons or creatures, not necessarily persons, in their own tears.
That was powerful for me. There is some way in which you have to go into another element, and it is with the people and with the animals.
Pietro Barbetta tells a story of a meeting he shared with Lynn in Bergamo, Italy. He was in conversation with a man from North Africa. In the midst of the session, the man declared that he will be descending into hell. At that point, Lynn jumped into the conversation. Now, I imagine that most therapists would inquire about what this hell was, perhaps engaging in a reframing of this idea of hell, and maybe would have sought for solutions in how to escape this hell. This is not what Lynn did. Lynn wanted to know who was going with this man into hell.
And he started to think about his father, his mother, his sister, and so Lynn was at this very moment. Lynn made this intervention. It was very nice. He said to me and to him, but there was no necessity to translate at this point, because the language was the body language. She could talk French or English or whatever. He was eager to understand everything. She said, "You can't take the green of your father and put him on your head." And he was looking at her, and then your sister here, your mother here, and possibly if you are other friends on the arms and so on. And then he was saying, "Oh yes, and I want to put you too on my arms." So she said, "Well, you can take the spirit of Dr. Barbetta and put it here, and my spirit and put her here, and you can go facing the hell." And he was, so happy about it. And at the very end, he said to her directly, "You remember me, my mother." And that's all. That's all the story.
Unlisted languages are the languages that animals and birds, small children, crazy people, and artists use to communicate. Could it be that most unlisted languages are in a form that should remain outside of the realm of words?
I think what I was trying to explain was the fact that what family therapy talked about or struggled to experience were things that had never been encountered. So it was the first encounter sense of the thing. I may not believe in what family therapy techniques are anymore, or in teaching them that way, but I do believe that we were just discovering the nondescript or unlisted languages that had not made it to the proper dictionary. That was an amazing feeling.
It's interesting to note that Lynn had a long-standing friendship with the French mime artist Marcel Marceau. Long before her years in family therapy, Lynn had a strong affinity to what she often calls dumb show, and more recently she calls unlisted languages. She seems to revel in the idea that there are ways of communicating that push far beyond words. Tom Anderson used to advise professionals to refrain from commenting about a person's body language. In other words, he asked to refrain from listing that which was unlisted in the shared movements of communication. We can and should use words to respond to the words people give to us, but the unlisted languages created by the body must be responded to by the body. In the modern world, and particularly in the language of our institutions, Words all too often are tools that enable us to talk about things. We create objects or things in language, so we can then act upon them. It calls for an obsession with precision, with doing away with ambiguity, and with this obsession, nouns are established and reified. Relations become invisible, and the very powers of poetry and metaphor hide away.
The way we live isn't like that, or if it does, if we live like that, then we're not living kind of a rich emotional life. If everything can be spoken about in that way with words and is clear, that then we can't, maybe we're not really expressing what's impressing us or hurting us most.
And our job is not to push them to talk, but is try to understand the way they express themselves. There was a fantastic psychoanalyst in France many years ago, during the 50s and the 60s, whose name was Gisela Panko. She was working with, they call boule d'argile, balls of clay, and what happened is that they put inside this movement of the hand what in France they call greffe de désir. Greffe de désir. So desire, making a difference. So they gave life to the creator. And something happened. So you have not to look at the oral system, you have to look at the hands.
This work Pietro describes is not a typical therapeutic act. It's not about fixing something broken. It isn't about bringing into the realm of talk stories of past trauma. Rather, it is an invitation to a creative act, to see oneself in the midst of life's creative forces. This is also a work of relationship, a work of connecting on the level of unlisted languages.
My job is to find the way to connect with a person. And now I'm thinking that the language is not important. My hands are more important than language. I think a story about a soldier that lives in a street, and I try to find a way to interact with him, to respect him and respect the way he lives and respect the way he acts. I start to shake his hand. Oh, that's not good. And then I try to find other way, and I remember, okay, I can try this. And now this is our conflict. So, I soldier.
Clara reports that this idea reminds her of Lynn Hoffman. She recalls Lynn at a conference at a university in Lisbon. Lynn made a point to hear the name of every person in the room and to have physical contact with each person, to shake their hand, touch them on the shoulder, to ensure that some form of body-to-body connection occurs with every person there.
I was working toward feelings and touch at this point and thinking we've neglected that. People resonate to each other. They hum together. They buzz like bees, and it changes the atmosphere. And I remembered how at the beach as a child we would dig tunnels toward each other under the sand when it was a little bit wet and would cohere. And that magic moment when your fingers scrabbling around touch the other person's fingers, that sort of sudden moment. We got it. So that was one of my images to try to explain the touching part, how you connect with another person. And it's a kind of gift exchange right then and there. Oh, I found you.
Ellen Landis belongs to a group of social workers and therapists called Share Vision. In Ellen's travels teaching about the idea of share vision, she had two particularly interesting experiences, one in Palestine and one in Israel. And both involve the expression of unlisted languages.
Even though it started with fear, with trepidation on my part, on some people's parts there, but there we are. One of the very beautiful things that happened was she took wet paint and she submerged her hands in black paint and then put them outside. The window was open and she just let her hands rest in the windowsill for quite some time. And she came back to the group afterwards as we're in the process and explained the drying of the paint on her hands was the first feeling that she had had in as long as she could remember, in a long time. A woman takes some of the supplies, she goes over and she takes duct tape. She wraps it around her wrist. Oh, she got help. Having it be wrapped around her wrists. And she got help and explained that somebody should put a piece of the gray duct tape over her mouth. And she walked and slowly, and she turned. I don't really need to say much more about that, I suppose.
The secret of talk that moves through underground channels is that it operates on a felt sense level rather than following codified rules for change. Gregory Bateson had certainly picked up on this idea because he talked in terms of a new epistemology. We used to think about a changing paradigm, but then I began to realize that it wasn't a paradigm. It was a form of language that acted as a language does but had no words. It was a kind of communication that no one had yet described.
The French philosopher Gilles Deleuze uses the word arborescence to describe the highly organized institutional structures accompanied by clearly delineated policies and procedures, divisions of labor, mission statements, and job descriptions. They are tree-like in their form. Things move up and down one cell at a time. They are organized around a central structure with branches tied to the center. Like trees, these structures, if they are well organized, are expected to live forever.
Deleuze and his writing partner, Guattari, compare the arborescence of the modern world with another botanical metaphor, that of the rhizome. A rhizome is a network of nodes and lines, usually found underground. Grass, most every weed in your garden, blackberry patches, they are all rhizomes. Human creations such as the internet, highway systems, the structure of many European cities, they are all rhizome-like creations as well. In fact, trees themselves, such as those found in this forest, are connected together, underground networks of fungus. They connect the trees of the forest together, enabling a passing of nutrients such as carbon and nitrogen from one tree to another, and then again enabling a sharing that benefits the entire forest. So in actuality, even the trees are fully embedded in rhizome worlds. They do not stand alone and separate.
The rhizome metaphor for Lynn eventually replaces the system metaphor, providing an image that further encourages her to see evolving realms of relationships, ecologies, rather than individually bounded identities. These rhizome worlds are never static, but are constantly moving, growing, adapting to the realities of their unique situations in life.
I remember being at Lynn's birthday party. I think it was her 80th. And we were in a room full of amazing people that she had gathered together in her honor. And I remember mentioning that the Family Therapy Networker magazine centerfold had her listed as one of the pioneers in the field of family therapy, but where were all her offspring? And I'm like looking around the room saying, oh my God, there's amazing people. And I just want to credit Chris for taking the time with Lynn to really document that and to create a diagram. When Lynn, she was so excited about this diagram that she came to one of our group Share Vision meetings, and she had her little bag, and the only thing in the bag was one piece of paper. And when it was her turn to share her check-in, she pulled out this diagram. We were all thrilled. And what a difference it made in her life to have some physical representation of all the ways that she's influenced people.
But to rethink my whole life in terms of this, and the lives of so many other people, that made what we were up to social bonds.
Trees are like nouns. Down with them. Step on them. The trees are hierarchical in shape and go from top to down and from down to top in that sense of levels of growth. And they're much less messy than rhizomes. And rhizomes have a different kind of immortality. Trees can produce copies of themselves. So can most organisms that we know, including ourselves. But rhizomes are immortal. The bloom lasts the summer, but the rhizome remains. So life goes underground in connecting ways that were never thought of by God the Father, I don't think. I really think religion has to be rethought with this different picture. Because there's no top person, no top phantom, no God, unless we invent one. That was the charm that really set me on this different course and began to make me look at all kinds of fields in a radically different way. And I feel that I've been searching for this, groping for 50 years, and that I'm finally seeing the outlines of the shift, the change that we are experiencing now.
The rhizome became a metaphor that gave both understanding of and direction to the ways we live our lives and the ways we engage in our work.
With the rhizome, it's just, for me, it just explains how things naturally are. If we don't block them with all the things we're told we should block them with, then that's just how things are. It doesn't matter how long they last or that they come from here to go there. They can be this and then there'll be something else and then go somewhere else. It doesn't have to be linear.
A rhizome is a way, it's not a way of relating. Is a way that we can describe how do we relate in life. And when I talk about we, I'm not talking just about human beings. I'm talking about plants and birds and stones and wind and stars and ocean and moons and sun and everything that exists, from the smallest atom, molecule, to the Milky Way, is a rhizome. So rhizome is just a way to describe how life is.
The underground. And that you can't rip out the underground.
Yeah.
So it's kind of counter to the underground and the explicitness of life, the injunction to make everything explicit, to excavate it and articulate it. But there's so much there that it lives on what's underground, and that you can't reach and you can't make visible, but you know it's there.
Everything is connected. That's what I think of when I think of rhizome. And rhizome is not obvious. And so there's connections that are happening, and I cannot assume anything. And so if I'm looking at a family, if I'm meeting somebody, if I'm working with somebody who I am assigned to in my role as a public health nurse, I don't know what their community is unless I find out. Because they might not even know until I ask them. So to be wise in asking the questions and to be listening and to say, oh, I heard you talk about your great-grandma. Tell me more about her. What gifts did you get from her? Tell me more about your teacher. What happened there? What else is going on that no one really maybe even knows about? And so even me at this time of my life, as a grandmother, as a mother, I have the gift of a rhizome that I can connect my family into. Well, they are connected into it, and help them become alive to that.
For Lynn, the rhizome idea was profoundly political, shedding light on many of the movements of our day, including Occupy Wall Street.
The descriptions of rhizome fit so well with the answers to problems that the Occupy movement grappled with. Think of an idea like leaderful rather than leaderless. That's wonderful. The way the Occupy movement people are governing themselves is highly defective, but also makes every citizen a part of the practice of living. The young people, who do not have a set idea as to how to be in society, they're the ones coming out and suggesting change, but not change to the old way of a dominant person, with people under that person along with a merit system and the declaring of goals. All these things are dissolving. That's the effect this Occupy Wall Street movement is having in our society.
If it's not good, if it's not working, let it go. I feel like in all over the world we are trying to running for, we must save this, we must save these boxes. For what? This doesn't bring us meaning. I don't think I'm seeing a rhizome. I feel I'm a part of it. Okay? And I think I'm a part of it when I'm addicted to questioning the truth. What truth?
There was an underground movement, a dissent, and I cannot imagine any other better example of rhizomatic network. These people were relying on each other, and they had these strong connections that if they broke or cut it may cost lives. But there were also thoughts about freedom and how things should be in the system. We should learn from our history a little bit and talk with these people who are still alive and who experience this networking in the time of no technology. People had more time to spend with each other because the work was less hours, and my mother and father in that period, they came at home at 3 o'clock. They were already at home, being with me and playing, going out. And now my mother comes from work at 6 o'clock. I don't know how it happened. Okay, so people had obviously more time to spend together and less technology. And now we have less time but more technology. And I think it could be used together. And it's future in this. Also learning from past how they did it.
There was another project that Lynn Hoffman and I worked on together. The idea of imagining our work not as a task of eradicating problems or pathologies, but as a work of gift exchange. This isn't a new idea at all. Aboriginal communities have used a language of gifts to describe their work with families for a long time. A work of gift exchange brings into the daily life of community a constant recognition of and response to the gifts of others. And our sense of community expands. The idea of gift exchange creates a spiraling push forward into relationship and life.
Interested in his ideas, which were an attempt to blow up the whole idea of pathology and reroute it to an exchange of gifts, so that the community people would list what gifts they felt the person on the spot had, and then the person on the spot would answer back with what the community had given him. So it was a gift exchange.
One of the things that I enjoyed most when I was writing reports on kids about their gifts was that, I could speak with all the other people in their life, their grandmother, their friend, their teacher, more friends, family or whatever, and I would sit down and I would read these things out loud to them, and it would touch them, because they weren't used to a professional actually saying such positive or constructive or even meaningful things, whether that was going out into nature or what have you. The more we could bring these gifts into awareness, the more alive, the more excited people became, and the more possibilities seemed to emerge.
The relational part of our day with all these kids, I believe that the anger and frustration they show us and they bring us as a gift, it's their response. It's a natural, innate response to their environment. Our being present, going, we hear you, and yeah, you're angry, and I'd be angry too. We relate back to that. There's an exchange of commonality of, again, side by side. I see what you're seeing. I get it. There's a beautiful exchange of gifts right there. The gift is, I get it. I hear you.
We've been working with a team that go and visit families that live in the poverty line in the Azores Islands. And the structure of the work they used to do was very hierarchical and very centered around the processes of controlling the families. There was this emotional negative contest where the professionals hated to have to visit the families, and the families hated to be visited. So we began thinking in a different perspective, and Lynn and your ideas were very part of this. And what would be the best conditions for us to be invited? If we have to be in their houses, can we find a way to feel that we are welcome and they want us there? So in one day we were having these 50 women in a room sharing their stories, like a couple that was saying they've planned to kill themselves because the man had an accident and he was in a wheelchair, so they thought that they really loved each other very much and they wanted to die, and they planned their suicide. And then they laid on the bed to kill themselves, and then began a conversation, and they decided not to, and decided that maybe there was life beyond this. And this woman was sharing this story in the middle of a group of 50 and saying, well, anyone that is thinking of killing themselves, please come to me and my husband, because we'd love to tell you how we decided that life was better than death. And it was so intense that people began sharing things about their homes and their relationships, and suddenly they were inviting people to come to their houses. And this was the beginning of 6 years of connections and dialogues, and of course there's a lot of difficult things in this relationship, but everything changed. But it was their idea, and they create the rhizome, and they knock at the doors, and they move to another group, and they go to tell their stories, and it's completely rhizomatic. So the sharing, the gift exchange was there. So Lynn is there since the beginning.
There is an ancient tale from Ireland. I first heard this story many years ago from Lynn. She felt a strong affinity to it. She was given the story from Imelda McCarthy of Dublin. This is the story of the crane bag lady. There was a pre-Christian Irish god named Manannán mac Lir. He had a wife named Aoife. One day, Manannán mac Lir laid claim to the alphabet. Now everybody knows that no one person, not even a god, can make such a claim. Aoife decided it was a shame that only Manannán mac Lir could benefit from the alphabet, so she, in turn, gave it away to whoever was interested. The god was very angry, and as punishment he transformed Aoife into a crane. But this did not stop her. In the face of such a challenge to his property, Manannán mac Lir's anger reached a new pitch. This time he murdered Aoife. But the gift did not stop. After her death, she became a large bag or net that traversed the shores of Ireland. As the tide came in, this bag gathered the gifts of the sea, treasures from faraway lands, and gifts from the deep. All the efforts by Manannán mac Lir to stop Aoife and the gift exchanges she had immersed herself within were to no avail. Even death did not stop the exchange. The gods of today's world are also staking ownership, laying claim to life's diversities. It is almost inconceivable to imagine the worlds of our modern institutions functioning outside of an economy of scarcity. Yet that is clearly what is being called for all over the world today. Martin Luther King once said, "All I am saying is simply this, that all life is interrelated, that somehow we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. You can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality."
Remember back when the kingdom comes. Remember back when the deed was done. He held on tight so she won't fly away. There was no wind on the wings of time. There were no hands in the lovergram. Just a tighted space, a tethered grace, and no room to find. But something fell and something broke. The walls, the doors, the woods, the yoke. Come on, love, let's wave it all goodbye. Come on, love, we're gonna learn to fly. it drifts from sea to sea, vestiges of a pharaoh's dreams. Nothing holds, nothing stays the same. The wind now billows on the wings of time. The hands are messy in the lovegram, in an unknown space, an unknown grace, and we'll learn to find. For something fell and something broke, the walls, the doors, the woods, the yoke. Come on, love, we'll wave it all goodbye. Come on, love, we're gonna learn to find. For something fell and something broke, the walls, the doors, the woods, the yoke. Come on, love, we'll wave it all goodbye. Come on, love, we're gonna learn to find. Down upon old island shore, where the waves can't break no more, a bird returns and she lays on down. The sea, she gave us everything we know. From her we came and her we'll go. It's another day, a beautiful day, and we have learned to find, and we have learned to